I remember the exact sound the dish rag made against the granite counter. A soft, repetitive whisper that filled the spaces between our words, between the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of my children's voices upstairs. I was wiping down a surface that was already clean, had been clean for the better part of an hour, but my hands needed something to do while Damien stood in my kitchen doorway, beer bottle sweating in his grip, that familiar laugh still hanging in the air between us. The light outside had turned that particular shade of amber that only happens in late September, filtering through the window above my sink and casting everything in gold. It made Damien look younger somehow, like the boy I remembered from high school, before 12 years of distance had carved lines around his eyes and taught him to hold his shoulders differently. He was telling me about something that had happened at the hardware store earlier, some mix-up with paint colors that had the old clerk muttering under his breath, and I was nodding along, making the appropriate sounds of amusement, but I wasn't really listening. I was watching the way his mouth moved when he spoke, the way his lips curved around certain words. I had always noticed these things about people, filed them away without thinking much of it, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. He paused mid-sentence to take a sip of his beer, and in that moment of silence, his gaze found mine and then drifted lower, just for a heartbeat. Just long enough for me to see something in his expression that I recognized, but couldn't name. Not desire exactly, though there was that too. Something softer. Something that looked like longing wrapped in confusion, like he was seeing me for the first time and trying to make sense of what he found there. My hands stilled against the counter. The dish rag bunched between my fingers. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that went deeper than thought, deeper than the careful explanations I had built my life around. For 32 years, I had been so certain of who I was, what I wanted, how my story was supposed to unfold. But in that kitchen, with the golden light fading and Damien looking at me like he was solving a puzzle he didn't know he had been working on, I felt the ground beneath my feet become uncertain. He must have seen something change in my face because he straightened up, cleared his throat, took another sip of beer like he could wash away whatever had just passed between us. The spell broke when Sophie came barreling into the kitchen, her small arms wrapping around my waist, her voice bright with the kind of urgency that only 7-year-olds can muster. She wanted to show me something, needed help with something, required my immediate attention for one of those monumentally important childhood crises that would be forgotten by morning. I kissed the top of her head, breathed in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, and told her it was almost bedtime. She protested, as she always did, but allowed herself to be led upstairs with promises of one extra story if she brushed her teeth, without complaint. When I glanced back at the kitchen doorway, Damien was still there, but he was looking out the window now, his profile sharp against the dimming light. Hours later, after Sophie and her brother were tucked into their beds, after Hannah had kissed me goodnight and settled into her own familiar sleep beside me, I lay staring at the ceiling and thinking about that look. About the way something had shifted in the air between Damien and me, like a door opening that I hadn't known existed. I could hear Hannah's breathing beside me, steady and trusting, and I felt like a stranger in my own life. The man she had married, the father my children knew, the person I had spent 32 years becoming suddenly felt like clothes that no longer fit. And somewhere in the darkness, Damien's laugh echoed in my memory alongside the weight of his gaze, and I knew that whatever had begun in that kitchen was only the beginning of something much larger than either of us was prepared for. There are places in this world that exist outside of time, where change arrives slowly and reluctantly, like winter snow that refuses to melt even when spring has officially begun. Millbrook, Virginia, is one of those places. It sits in a valley between two gentle hills, surrounded by farmland that has been worked by the same families for generations, where the main street still has a proper hardware store and a diner that serves coffee in ceramic mugs that have never seen the inside of a dishwasher. I have lived here for most of my 32 years, first as a child in a house 3 streets over from where I live now, then as a college student who came home every weekend to help my father with yard work, and finally as a man who never quite found a reason to leave. My house is white-painted brick with black shutters, a front porch that Hannah decorated with hanging ferns, and a lawn that I mow every Saturday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. The neighbors have come to expect the sound of my mower like they expect the church bells that ring every Sunday at 9. From the outside, I suppose my life looks exactly like what it is: carefully constructed, deliberately maintained, predictably safe. I teach 11th grade English at the same high school I attended, in the same classroom where Mrs. Henderson tried to convince me that I had a gift for writing. I coach Little League on Thursday evenings and volunteer for the annual church fundraiser every October. When the Pattersons down the street throw their summer barbecue, I am the one who brings the pitcher of sweet tea and helps Jim flip burgers while the children run through sprinklers in the backyard. People in Millbrook know what to expect from me. I am reliable. I am steady. I am the kind of man who remembers birthdays and always offers to help neighbors move furniture and never causes drama at town council meetings. I have built a reputation on being exactly who I appear to be, and for a long time, that felt like enough. Hannah and I met at First Baptist when we were both 20, still young enough to believe that love was something that happened to you rather than something you chose every day. She was singing in the choir, her voice clear and sweet above the others, and I was sitting in the third pew where my family had claimed the same spot for decades. After the service, I worked up the courage to compliment her on the hymn selection, and she smiled at me with the kind of warmth that made me feel like I had been waiting my whole life to be noticed by someone exactly like her. Our courtship was everything our parents expected it to be. We dated for 2 years, during which we held hands at church dinners and took long walks around the lake and discussed our shared vision of a simple, faithful life. We married when we were 22, in the same sanctuary where we had met, surrounded by everyone we had ever known, and moved into the house on Maple Street that had belonged to Hannah's grandmother. For 10 years, we have lived that vision. Hannah teaches 2nd grade at the elementary school. I teach high school English. We attend every school function, every church social, every community event that requires our presence. We have 2 beautiful children who are polite and well-behaved and do their homework without being asked. We take family vacations to the same cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains every summer and send Christmas cards with our picture on them every December. We are, by any reasonable measure, successful, happy, even, in the way that people who have built their lives on shared values and mutual respect can be happy. We rarely fight. We divide household responsibilities fairly. We support each other's goals and make decisions together and present a united front when it comes to parenting. Our friends consider us one of the solid couples, the ones who will still be together when everyone else has divorced and remarried and moved away. But in the quiet moments, when the children are asleep and the house is still and Hannah is reading beside me in bed, I sometimes feel like I am watching my life happen to someone else. We have not touched each other, really touched each other, in months. Not since sometime last spring when she reached for me in the dark, and I found myself thinking about something else, someone else, and the guilt made me pull away before anything could begin. She did not ask why. I did not offer an explanation. We simply adjusted to the new distance between us, like people who have learned to navigate around a piece of furniture that cannot be moved. I tell myself that this is normal, that most marriages go through periods of dormancy, that the passion we felt at 22 was never meant to sustain a lifetime anyway. I tell myself that partnership and companionship are more valuable than desire, that what Hannah and I have built together is worth more than whatever I might think I am missing. I tell myself these things, and I almost believe them, until Damien comes back to town and reminds me of all the questions I thought I had put to rest. Damien left Millbrook the day after high school graduation, 12 years ago. He had been accepted to college in Denver, a scholarship for baseball that would take him farther from home than anyone in our class had ever gone. I remember standing in his driveway that last morning, watching him load boxes into the back of his father's pickup truck, trying to find words for something I did not understand myself. He hugged me goodbye the way boys do, quick and awkward, and promised to write. He did for a while. Long letters about mountain air and snow in October, and classmates who came from places I had only seen in movies. Then the letters became postcards, then emails, then silence. Over the years, News of Damien filtered back through the network of mothers and former teachers that keeps track of everyone who has ever lived in a small town. He had graduated with a degree in architecture. He was working for a firm in Seattle. He was designing buildings that reached toward the sky in ways that nothing in Millbrook ever had. There were rumors, of course, the kind that follow young men who leave small towns and never bring anyone home for Christmas. People said he was probably gay, or at least different, and they said it with the mixture of pity and disapproval that small towns reserve for those who refuse to follow expected patterns. I never contributed to these conversations, but I never defended him either. When someone would mention Damien at a church dinner or a school function, I would nod and make appropriate sounds and change the subject as quickly as politeness allowed. The truth was that thinking about Damien made me uncomfortable in ways I could not name, brought back memories of our friendship that I had carefully buried beneath years of marriage and responsibility and purposeful forgetting. Then his father died suddenly last March, a heart attack that took him while he was working in his garden, and Damien came home for the funeral. I saw him across the cemetery, standing beside the grave in a dark suit that looked expensive and strange against the familiar backdrop of our hometown. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe it was just the way he carried himself now, with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate a larger world. His hair was shorter, streaked with gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting at distant mountains. After the service, people gathered at the community center for the kind of meal that small towns provide for families in crisis: casseroles and fried chicken and sweet tea served on paper plates. I stood with Hannah and the children, accepting condolences and making conversation with neighbors, but I found myself watching Damien across the room. He moved through the crowd with grace, accepting hugs from women who had known him as a boy, shaking hands with men who remembered when he hit the winning home run in the regional championship. Everyone welcomed him like a distant cousin returning from war, with the mixture of curiosity and affection reserved for those who have left and come back changed. I wanted to approach him, to offer my condolences and ask about his life and bridge the 12 years that had passed since we last spoke. But something held me back, some instinct that warned me that approaching Damien would be like opening a door I had spent years learning to keep closed. So I stayed across the room, watching him interact with everyone except me, and tried to ignore the way my pulse quickened every time his laugh carried over the crowd. A week later, Hannah mentioned that Damien had decided to stay in Millbrook, at least temporarily, to settle his father's affairs and decide what to do with the house. She had heard this from Mary Patterson, who had heard it from the woman at the post office, who had seen Damien picking up mail that had been accumulating since his father's death. Small towns are efficient networks for the circulation of information, especially information about anyone who might be considered newsworthy. I found myself driving past his father's house on my way to work, taking a route that was slightly longer than necessary just to see if there were signs of habitation. The house sat on 2 acres at the edge of town, a rambling colonial that had been beautiful once but had grown shabby in the years since Damien's mother died. I could see lights in the windows, a rental car in the driveway, and once, a figure moving around in what I remembered as the kitchen. I never stopped. I never even slowed down. But I started taking that route every day, like a habit I could not break. Then came the evening in my kitchen, the moment when our carefully maintained distance finally collapsed under the weight of a single glance. The evening when I realized that some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again. The evening when Damien looked at me the way he had looked at me once before, during our sophomore year of college, in his dorm room after a party where we had both drunk too much and said things we pretended not to remember the next day. That night in college, we had almost crossed a line that would have changed everything between us. Almost. But morning came and brought with it the clarity of sobriety and the fear of consequences, and we never spoke of what had nearly happened. I went back to my own dorm, my own life, my own carefully constructed plans for the future. A year later, I was engaged to Hannah. A year after that, I was married. But now Damien is back, and he is looking at me again with that same mixture of longing and confusion, and I am beginning to understand that some things cannot be buried so deeply that they disappear forever. Some things wait, patient and persistent, until circumstances align in ways that make denial impossible. I am 32 years old. I have a wife who trusts me and children who depend on me and a community that expects me to be exactly who I have always been. I have built my entire adult life on the foundation of choices I made when I was too young to understand what I was choosing between. But in the amber light of my kitchen, with Damien's eyes on mine and my daughter's arms around my waist, I felt that foundation begin to shift. And I knew, with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute truth, that everything I thought I knew about myself was about to change. The invitation came 3 days later, delivered with the kind of casual ease that made it impossible to refuse without seeming strange. I was grading papers at the kitchen table when Damien called, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that made me forget, momentarily, how much distance had grown between us over the years. He said he was drowning in his father's belongings, boxes and boxes of memories that needed sorting before he could decide what to do with the house. He wondered if I might have a few hours on Saturday to help him make sense of it all. In exchange, he promised dinner and whatever beer was left in his father's refrigerator. I said yes before I had time to consider whether I should. Hannah looked up from her book when I hung up the phone, and I told her about the favor as casually as I could manage. She nodded and said it was kind of me to help, that losing a parent was hard enough without having to face their belongings alone. Her generosity made me feel guilty in ways I could not explain, even to myself. Saturday arrived gray and humid, the kind of late September day that promises rain but never delivers. I drove to Damien's father's house with my windows down, breathing in the scent of dying leaves and distant with smoke. The house looked different in daylight than it had during my furtive drive-bys, smaller somehow, and more tired. Paint peeled from the shutters, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of accumulated seasons. But there were signs of attention, too. The lawn had been mowed recently, and someone had planted new flowers in the beds beside the front steps. Damien answered the door in old jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, his hair mussed and his hands already dusty from whatever work he had started before I arrived. He looked more like the boy I remembered than he had at the funeral, and something in my chest loosened at the sight of him. He led me upstairs to the attic, a cramped space under the eaves that smelled of cedar and time and secrets that had been stored too long in the dark. The boxes were everywhere, stacked and scattered, and spilling their contents across the wooden floor. Decades of a life lived fully and messily. Christmas decorations tangled with fishing gear, photo albums mixed with tax returns, children's drawings layered between important documents that should have been filed somewhere safe. Damien's father had been a man who saved everything, apparently, including things that most people would have thrown away years ago. We worked in comfortable silence at first, establishing a rhythm of sorting and deciding and creating piles for keeping, donating, and discarding. It felt good to have something concrete to do with my hands, something that required decision-making without emotional weight. This box of outdated electronics could go to the donation center. These financial records needed to be kept for at least another year. This collection of vintage postcards might be worth something to someone who collected such things. Then Damien opened a box that made him laugh out loud, a sound so sudden and delighted that I looked up from the pile of magazines I had been sorting. He was holding up our old high school yearbook, the cover faded but still recognizable, and beneath it were mixed tapes we had made for each other during our junior year, their labels written in our teenage handwriting with song titles that seemed impossibly important at the time. We spent the next hour excavating that box like archaeologists discovering evidence of an ancient civilization. There were photographs of parties I had forgotten, ticket stubs for movies that had seemed profound when we were 17, and a worn notebook that I recognized immediately even though I had not seen it in 15 years. It was our bet book, the place where we had recorded all the ridiculous dares and challenges that had defined our friendship during high school. Damien opened it carefully, as if it were a religious text, and began reading entries in a voice that grew softer with each page. There was the bet about who could go longest without using their car, which Damien had won by riding his bicycle everywhere for 3 weeks in January. There was the challenge to see who could memorize more Shakespeare sonnets, which I had won by a narrow margin. There were dares that had seemed dangerous then, but looked harmless now, evidence of how small our world had been and how large our courage had felt within its boundaries. Then he found the entry that made the air between us change. His voice faltered as he read it aloud, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach even before I heard the words. Bet. Damien swears he'll never fall for a guy. Says it's not possible. Loser owes the winner 2 packs of Oreos. We both laughed, but the sound was different now, hollow and uncertain. I remembered the day that bet had been made with a clarity that surprised me. It was during our senior year, sometime in early spring, when the possibility of college and adulthood was beginning to feel real instead of theoretical. We had been walking home from baseball practice, and Damien had been talking about some girl he had met at a party the weekend before, describing her in the way that teenage boys do when they are trying to prove something to themselves as much as to their friends. I had made some comment about how he seemed to fall for someone new every month, and he had gotten defensive in a way that struck me as odd even then. He said he knew exactly what he wanted, that he was not confused about anything, that some things were just not possible for people like him. The bet had been his idea, his way of closing a door on a conversation that had started to make him uncomfortable. But I remembered something else about that day, something I had buried so deeply that it took seeing the bet written in his teenage handwriting to bring it back. The week before, we had been at his house studying for a history exam, and I had dozed off on his bed while he worked at his desk. When I woke up, he was sitting beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his leg against mine, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. When he realized I was awake, he had jumped up and started talking about the weather, but not before I saw something in his eyes that looked like hunger mixed with fear. The bet about never falling for a guy had been made 3 days later. Now, 15 years after the fact, we sat in his father's dusty attic with that notebook between us, and Damien said quietly, "I was such an idiot back then." He was not looking at me when he said it, but I could hear something in his voice that had not been there before, a note of regret that made me wonder what else he remembered about those days that I had tried so hard to forget. As the afternoon wore on, we finished sorting through the immediate boxes and moved downstairs to the back porch with beer that was indeed still cold and a pizza that Damien had ordered from the place in town that had been serving the same thin crust recipe for as long as either of us could remember. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the windows of the house and made everything look softer, more forgiving. We talked about safer things then, his work in Seattle, my teaching, the ways the town had changed and stayed the same during his absence. But underneath the casual conversation, I could feel the weight of that notebook, of all the things we had never said to each other, of the questions that had been hanging between us since we were teenagers who thought we understood ourselves better than we actually did. Finally, as the light began to fade and the air grew cooler, Damien leaned back in his chair and said, "What if I was wrong about a lot of things?" He was looking out at the yard when he said it, not at me, but something in his tone made my heart begin to beat faster. I did not ask him what he meant. I was not sure I was ready for the answer. That evening became the first of many. Damien would call with some task that required an extra pair of hands, some project that would benefit from a second opinion, some meal that was too much trouble to cook for one person. I would find reasons to say yes, excuses that sounded reasonable to Hannah and to myself. I was helping a friend through a difficult time. I was being a good neighbor. I was doing what anyone in a small town would do for someone who was dealing with loss and change. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than that. The truth was that being around Damien made me feel like myself in ways I had forgotten were possible. When we worked together on some project, when we sat on his porch talking about books or politics or the small dramas of small-town life, I felt awake in a way that I had not felt in years. I felt interesting and interested, engaged with the world instead of just moving through it. The invitations became routine. Coffee on Tuesday mornings before school. Help with painting the front porch on Thursday evening. walks around the lake on Sunday afternoons when Hannah thought I was running errands. We started meeting more often than made sense for two people who were supposedly just renewing an old friendship, but neither of us acknowledged what was happening. We maintained the fiction that these encounters were casual, coincidental, the natural result of two people who had grown up together finding comfort in familiar company. But I began to notice things I should not have been noticing. The way Damien's hands moved when he was explaining something he cared about. The sound of his laugh when I said something that genuinely amused him. The way he looked at me sometimes when he thought I was not paying attention, with an expression that reminded me of that long-ago afternoon in his bedroom when I had woken up to find him watching me sleep. One evening in early October, we were sitting on my back steps after I had helped him move some furniture he was planning to donate. Hannah was inside helping the children with homework, and we could hear their voices through the kitchen window, the ordinary sounds of family life continuing around us. Damien was quiet, more contemplative than usual, turning his beer bottle in his hands like he was trying to work up the courage to say something important. I was talking about something inconsequential, some minor drama from school that had seemed worth sharing, when I realized he was not listening. He was staring at my hands, or more specifically, at my wedding ring, watching the way I twisted it around my finger without thinking, a nervous habit I had developed over the years whenever I felt uncertain about something. The conversation died away, leaving us sitting in silence while the sounds of my family's evening routine continued behind us. Hannah called to one of the children about bath time. Sophie laughed at something her brother had said. The ordinary, precious sounds of the life I had built, the life I was supposed to want more than anything else in the world. But sitting there with Damien watching me twist my wedding ring around and around, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a drop that was both terrifying and irresistible. I felt like everything I thought I knew about myself was balanced on the edge of that moment, waiting for someone to say the words that would send it all tumbling into the void. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there in the gathering dusk, two men who had been boys together, who had shared secrets and dreams and fears before we learned to hide them from each other and ourselves. We sat there knowing that something was shifting between us, something that had been building since that first evening in my kitchen, since the moment I had caught him looking at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle he had been working on for most of his life. The screen door opened behind us, and Hannah appeared with a dish towel in her hands, smiling at both of us with the kind of easy warmth that made me understand why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. She asked if we wanted more beer, if Damien was staying for dinner, if there was anything she could do to help with whatever project we were working on. Her kindness was effortless and genuine, and it made what I was feeling sitting next to Damien seem even more dangerous than it already was. Damien politely declined her offers and said he should be getting home. He stood up, brushed dust from his jeans, and thanked me for the help. But as he was leaving, he looked back at me one more time, and in that glance I saw everything we had not said to each other, everything we were both afraid to acknowledge. That night, lying in bed beside Hannah while she read and I pretended to grade papers, I could not stop thinking about the way Damien had looked at my wedding ring, and the way that look had made me feel like I was wearing someone else's life instead of living my own. The changes began so gradually that I convinced myself they were coincidental. Small adjustments to routines I had followed for years, tiny rebellions against a life that had started to feel like a costume I wore rather than skin I inhabited. I found myself volunteering for fewer committees at church, declining invitations to social gatherings that had once seemed essential to maintaining my place in the community. When Mrs. Peterson asked if I would help organize the annual Harvest Festival, I heard myself saying I was too busy this year, though I could not have explained what exactly was keeping me so occupied. For the first time in a decade, I skipped Sunday service. I told Hannah I was feeling under the weather, which was not entirely a lie since something inside me did feel unsettled, off balance in ways I could not name. She pressed her hand to my forehead with the automatic concern of a wife and mother, then took the children to church alone. I spent those morning hours walking through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, past houses where families were getting ready for worship, past the life I had built and was now, apparently, learning to step away from. My walks grew longer and more frequent. I would tell Hannah I needed to clear my head after a difficult day of teaching, or that I wanted to get some exercise before dinner. She never questioned these explanations, trusting in the way that people do when they have shared a life for 10 years and believe they know each other completely. But the truth was that my feet seemed to carry me, without conscious direction, past the edge of town where Damien's father's house sat among its 2 acres of neglected land. Sometimes I would see him working in the yard, raking leaves or repairing some piece of the property that had been ignored too long. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him through the kitchen window as he moved around inside, and I would feel something tighten in my chest that I refused to examine too closely. I told myself I was simply concerned about an old friend who was dealing with loss and change, but even I was not entirely convinced by this explanation. More often than not, I found reasons to stop. A borrowed book that needed returning. A casserole that Hannah had made too much of and thought Damien might enjoy. Tools that I claimed to need but could easily have purchased at the hardware store. The excuses grew thinner over time, but Damien never questioned them. He would invite me in for coffee or beer, and we would talk about safe subjects while something unspoken hummed in the air between us. I began to notice changes in him too. The casual confidence he had displayed during those first few weeks back in town was giving way to something more careful, more deliberate. He seemed to weigh his words before speaking, as if he was afraid of saying too much or too little. But his eyes had grown bolder, more direct in their attention. When we talked, he would watch my face with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously seen and exposed, like he was reading messages I had not meant to send. One afternoon in mid-October, I found him trying to repair a broken window frame on the south side of the house. The wood was rotted in places, swollen from years of weather and neglect, and he was struggling to fit a new pane of glass into a frame that had warped beyond its original dimensions. I offered to help, and we worked together in companionable silence, him holding the glass steady while I used a putty knife to scrape away the old glazing compound. The work required us to stand close together, our shoulders nearly touching as we maneuvered around the awkward angle of the window. I could smell his soap, something clean and unfamiliar that reminded me of places I had never been. When we both reached for the same tool at the same moment, our hands brushed, just fingers against fingers, but the contact sent something electric through my arm and into my chest. Damien pulled his hand away immediately, as if he had been burned. But I did not move. I stood there with my fingers still extended toward the space where his had been, staring at my own hand, as if it belonged to someone else. For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, we both remained frozen, him looking anywhere but at me looking at nothing but the place where our skin had touched. Finally, he cleared his throat and made some comment about the stubborn nature of old wood. I agreed and handed him the tool he had been reaching for. We finished the repair without speaking, but something had shifted in the air between us, some boundary that had been crossed even though neither of us had intended to cross it. That evening, after dinner and homework and the usual bedtime routines, I told Hannah I needed to go for a drive. She looked up from the magazine she was reading, and for a moment I thought she might ask where I was going or why I suddenly needed to be somewhere else. But she simply nodded and said to be careful, that there had been more deer on the roads lately with hunting season approaching. I drove without conscious destination, letting my hands on the steering wheel make decisions that my mind was not ready to acknowledge. I found myself at the lake where Damien and I had spent countless summer afternoons during high school, swimming and fishing and talking about futures that had seemed both inevitable and impossibly distant. It was a small lake, really more of a large pond, surrounded by trees that were just beginning to turn and fed by a creek that ran down from the hills. I parked in the gravel lot where teenagers still came to drink beer and fumble through first kisses in the backs of their parents' cars. My headlights swept across the water as I turned off the engine, and I saw another vehicle already there, a truck I recognized even in the darkness. Damien was sitting on the tailgate, his legs dangling over the edge, staring out at the water that reflected the stars like scattered diamonds. He did not seem surprised to see me. He did not wave or call out or acknowledge my arrival in any obvious way. But when I got out of my car and walked toward him, he moved over slightly on the tailgate, making room for me to sit beside him. I climbed up without asking if it was okay, without explaining why I was there or how I had known to find him. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, both of us looking out at the water instead of at each other. The night was clear and cold, the kind of October evening that carries the promise of winter in its edges. I could hear the soft sound of water lapping against the shore, the distant call of night birds, the whisper of wind through leaves that would soon fall. Finally, because someone had to speak, and because the silence was becoming heavier than words, I said, "Did you ever regret not asking the question?" I did not specify which question, but somehow I knew he would understand. There had been so many questions between us over the years, so many things we had wondered about each other, but never dared to voice aloud. He was quiet for so long that I began to think he was not going to answer. Then, still looking out at the water, he said, "I think I always knew the answer scared me." His voice was soft, barely audible above the sound of the lake, but I heard every word with perfect clarity. We did not touch. We did not even turn to face each other. But something fundamental shifted in that moment, some admission that changed the nature of everything that had come before and everything that would come after. We sat there on the tailgate of his truck, two men who had been boys together, and acknowledged without saying it directly that we had been circling around the same unspoken truth for most of our lives. I do not know how long we stayed there. Long enough for the cold to seep through our jackets, long enough for the stars to move noticeably across the sky. Eventually, without discussion, we both climbed down from the truck. Damien said he should probably head home, and I agreed that I should do the same. We did not make plans to meet again, did not acknowledge what had just happened between us. But as I drove home through the empty streets of our small town, I felt like I was returning to a life that no longer fit me properly, like trying to wear clothes that had shrunk while I was away. Hannah was already asleep when I slipped into bed beside her. She stirred slightly when the mattress moved under my weight, but she did not wake. I lay there in the darkness, listening to her steady breathing, and tried to reconcile the man who had sat beside Damien at the lake with the man who shared this bed, this house, this carefully constructed life. The next morning was a Saturday, and I woke to find Sophie at the kitchen table with her coloring books and crayons spread across the surface like an art installation. She was working on a picture with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly between her lips the way it did when she was focused on something important. When I asked what she was drawing, she looked up at me with the serious expression that 7-year-olds reserve for matters of great significance. "It's our family," she said, turning the paper so I could see her work. There we were, rendered in crayon with the kind of attention to detail that children bring to the things they care about most. Hannah with her yellow hair and blue dress. Sophie herself with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. Her brother with his baseball cap and the superhero t-shirt he wore every chance he got. And me, standing slightly apart from the others, my face colored with brown crayon in what was unmistakably a frown. I stared at the drawing, struck by how clearly my daughter had seen something I thought I had been hiding. "Why am I frowning in your picture?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and curious rather than concerned. Sophie shrugged with the matter-of-fact honesty that children possess before they learn to protect other people's feelings. "You always look sad, Daddy. Even when you're smiling, you look sad in your eyes." Her words hit me with the force of recognition, the way truth does when it comes from an unexpected source. I looked at my daughter's drawing again, at the careful way she had captured something about me that I had not realized was visible to others. Standing there in my kitchen, looking at myself through my 7-year-old daughter's eyes, I understood that whatever was happening between Damien and me was no longer something I could hide, even from myself. The transformation had begun whether I was ready for it or not. The life I had built with such care and intention was starting to crack along fault lines I had not known existed. And somewhere in the space between my daughter's crayon portrait and the memory of sitting beside Damien at the lake, I began to understand that I was going to have to choose between the man I had always been and the man I was apparently becoming. The revelation came on a Thursday night in late October, delivered through the sound of rain against my front door and the sight of Damien standing on my porch, soaked and swaying slightly in a way that told me he had been drinking. It was past 9 o'clock, late enough that Hannah and the children were already asleep upstairs, early enough that I was still awake in the living room, grading papers and trying not to think about the conversation we had shared at the lake. When I opened the door, he looked at me with eyes that were bright and unfocused, his hair plastered to his head by the rain, his jacket dark with water. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, seeming to struggle with words that were either too important or too dangerous to say carelessly. I stepped back to let him in, but he shook his head and remained where he was, rain dripping from his clothes onto the welcome mat that Hannah had chosen because it said "Home Sweet Home" in cheerful yellow letters. I made fun of something I didn't understand, he said finally, his words slightly slurred but clear enough that I caught every one. But I think I've always been looking for someone like you. The statement hung in the air between us like something fragile and breakable, like glass that might shatter if either of us moved too quickly or spoke too loudly. I felt my heart begin to pound in a way that made me dizzy, felt something in my chest open and close simultaneously. I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to invite him inside where we could talk properly, wanted to do something with the gift he had just given me. But before I could respond, before I could even fully process what he had said, he turned and walked back into the rain, leaving me standing in my doorway with his words echoing in my head and the sound of his footsteps disappearing into the darkness. I watched him go until his figure was swallowed by the night, my heart still beating too fast, my hands trembling slightly as I closed the door. Upstairs, I could hear Hannah stirring in her sleep, and the sound brought me back to the reality of where I was, who I was supposed to be, what my life looked like to anyone who might be watching. I turned off the porch light and went to bed, but I did not sleep. I lay beside my wife, staring at the ceiling, and replayed Damien's words over and over until they wore grooves in my memory. The next morning, I found the letter. It was tucked into my mailbox between the electric bill and a catalog for garden supplies, folded once and written on paper that looked familiar. When I unfolded it, I realized it was torn from our old Bet notebook, the same notebook we had found in his father's attic weeks ago. On one side was our teenage handwriting, recording some long-forgotten wager about baseball statistics or movie trivia. On the other side, in Damien's current handwriting, were words that made my knees go weak. "I owe you Oreos. You win." I didn't know it then, but I was already halfway in love with you. I stood there in my driveway, holding the paper with hands that would not stop shaking, reading those words again and again as if repetition might make them easier to understand. Around me, the morning was proceeding normally. Mrs. Patterson was walking her dog. The school bus was making its rounds. Hannah was inside getting the children ready for another ordinary day. But I felt like I was standing at the center of an earthquake that only I could feel, like the ground beneath my feet was splitting apart while everything else remained exactly as it had always been. I walked to the garage, needing privacy to process what I had just read, needing space to breathe without worrying about who might see me or what they might think. The garage smelled of motor oil and dust, and the lingering scent of summer lawnmower gas, familiar smells that usually grounded me in the routines of home ownership and responsibility. But today they felt like artifacts from someone else's life, reminders of a man I was no longer sure I wanted to be. I read the letter one more time, then folded it carefully and put it in my wallet, next to my driver's license and credit cards and the school picture of my children that I carried everywhere. Then, for the first time since I was a child, I cried. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that. Not from confusion, though I was certainly confused. I cried from the terror of clarity, from the overwhelming relief of finally understanding something about myself that I had been hiding from for most of my adult life. The day passed in a blur of routine activities that felt increasingly surreal. I taught my classes, graded papers, attended a faculty meeting about standardized test scores. I picked up milk on the way home, helped Sophie with her math homework, listened to my son describe the fort he was building in the backyard. I did all the things that made up my normal life. but I felt like an actor playing a role I had memorized so well that I could perform it without thinking. When evening came, I told Hannah I needed to go for a walk. She looked at me more carefully than usual, and I wondered if she could see the change in me, if whatever was happening inside was visible from the outside the way my sadness had been visible to Sophie. But she simply nodded and said she would wait up for me, and I kissed her forehead the way I had done thousands of times before, knowing as I did it that something fundamental had shifted in the gesture. I did not go for a walk. I went to Damien's house, moving through the familiar streets of our town, like someone following a map to a destination I had been avoiding my entire life. The house was lit from within, warm yellow lights spilling from the windows onto the front porch, where we had sat so many evenings talking about everything except the thing that mattered most. When he answered the door, he looked surprised to see me, then worried, as if he was afraid I had come to tell him that his drunken confession had ruined everything between us. But before he could speak, before he could apologize or take back what he had said, I looked at him and said the only thing that felt true anymore. I can't lie anymore. He stepped back to let me in, and I followed him to the living room where we had spent so many hours pretending to be just old friends catching up. But this time, instead of sitting in separate chairs and maintaining the careful distance we had always preserved, we sat together on the couch, close enough that our shoulders touched, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body against mine. We did not kiss. We did not make declarations or promises or plans for the future. We simply sat there, two men who had been boys together, who had spent 15 years dancing around a truth that was finally too large to ignore. We sat there with our shoulders touching, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the world was settling into the quiet that comes after storms have passed. Inside, in the warm light of Damien's living room, with his shoulder warm against mine and his breathing steady beside me, I understood that I had crossed a line from which there would be no returning. The life I had built, the man I had been, the future I had planned, all of it was going to change now, and there was no going back to the safety of not knowing. But sitting there beside him, feeling more myself than I had felt in years, I found that I was not afraid of the change anymore. I was only afraid of how long it had taken me to get here, and how much of both our lives we had spent pretending we were people we were not. The conversation with Hannah happened on a Tuesday morning in November, after the children had left for school and the house had settled into the kind of quiet that only exists when familiar routines have cleared the space for difficult truths. I found her in the kitchen, standing at the counter with her coffee mug in both hands, staring out the window at the bare branches of the maple tree we had planted together during our second year of marriage. She must have sensed something in the way I entered the room, some change in my presence that made her turn to look at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as if she was preparing herself for news she had been expecting without knowing she was expecting it. I sat down at the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals, where we had planned our children's birthday parties and discussed household budgets, and made all the small decisions that accumulate into a shared life. The morning light coming through the window fell across the surface in a way that made everything look both familiar and strange, like a photograph of a place I had lived long ago. "Hannah," I said, and then stopped, because how do you begin to dismantle a life with words? How do you explain to someone who has trusted you completely that you have been living as a version of yourself that was never entirely real? She set down her coffee mug and sat across from me, her hands folded in her lap in the way they always were when she was trying to remain calm about something that scared her. For a moment we just looked at each other, two people who had shared a bed and raised children together and built something solid and good, but who had maybe never truly seen each other as clearly as we should have. "Something in me has shifted," I said finally, the words coming out quieter than I had intended. Or maybe it always was this way, and I'm only now seeing it clearly. I couldn't bring myself to say Damien's name, couldn't make the situation more concrete than it already was. But somehow I knew that she would understand what I was telling her, would hear in my careful words all the things I was not saying directly. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I began to wonder if she was going to respond at all. Outside, I could hear the sounds of our neighborhood continuing its normal rhythm. A lawnmower starting up somewhere down the street, children's voices from the playground at the elementary school, the ordinary sounds of a world that had not stopped turning just because mine was falling apart. Finally, she looked at me with eyes that were sad but not surprised, and said, "I always wondered if I married the version of you who was safest." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if she was stating something she had known for a long time but had never said aloud. There was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just a kind of weary recognition that made my chest ache with guilt and something that might have been relief. The practical arrangements were discussed with the same calm efficiency that Hannah brought to everything in our life together. I would move into the guest room while we figured out what came next. We would tell the children that I needed some time to think, that sometimes adults had to work through complicated feelings before they could be the parents their children deserved. We would continue to share meals and household responsibilities while we adjusted to this new configuration of our family. When Sophie asked why Daddy was sleeping in the other room, Hannah knelt down to her level and said, with the kind of gentle honesty that made me love her even as I was leaving her, that sometimes people needed space to understand who they really were. Sophie nodded with the acceptance that children have for adult explanations that don't quite make sense but are delivered with enough confidence to seem reasonable. I watched Hannah handle our children's confusion with strength that left me awed and guilty in equal measure. She answered their questions without lying, maintained their routines without making them feel responsible for the tension they could sense but not understand. She protected them from the details of our unraveling while still acknowledging that change was happening, and I found myself thinking that she deserved better than a husband who had taken 32 years to figure out who he actually was. The guest room felt like a hotel, all neutral colors and impersonal furniture, but it also felt like the first honest space I had occupied in years. I lay awake the first night listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, sounds I had heard every night for a decade, but which now seemed to belong to someone else's life. Down the hall, Hannah was sleeping alone in the bed we had shared since we were newlyweds, and I wondered if she felt relief or abandonment, if she was grieving the end of what we had been or celebrating the beginning of what she might become without me. After a week of this strange new domestic arrangement, I went to Damien's house. I had been thinking about him constantly, about the letter he had written on the back of our old bed, about the evening we had sat together on his couch with our shoulders touching and everything unspoken finally acknowledged between us. I had imagined him waiting for me, ready to step into whatever came next now that I had finally admitted the truth about who I was and what I wanted. But when he opened the door, he did not look like someone who had been waiting. He looked tired and wary, older than he had seemed just days before. He let me in, but he did not move to embrace me or take my hand or do any of the things I had imagined might happen when I finally came to him as a free man. Instead, he stood in the middle of his living room with his arms crossed and said, "You don't get to make me your escape route." His voice was not angry, but it was firm in a way that made me understand that he had been thinking about this moment as much as I had, and had come to different conclusions about what it meant. "I need to know it's real," he continued, looking at me with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "Not just convenient. Not just because your marriage isn't working and I happen to be here. I need to know that this is about wanting me, not about running away from something else." His words hit me like cold water, shocking me into a clarity I had not expected. Of course, he was right to be careful. Of course, he deserved more than to be someone's convenient alternative to a life that had stopped fitting. He had spent 12 years away from this town, had built a life of his own that he was now willing to risk for the possibility of something real between us. He was not going to settle for being my way out of a situation I had created for myself. I stood there in his living room, surrounded by furniture that belonged to his father and boxes that still needed unpacking, and realized that I had no idea what I was asking for or what I was prepared to offer in return. I had been so focused on the courage it had taken to leave my marriage that I had not thought clearly about what I wanted to build in its place. But looking at Damien, Seeing the way he was protecting himself from the possibility of being hurt by someone who had already proven capable of living a lie for most of his adult life, I knew that I wanted to try. I wanted to discover what might be possible between us if we were both brave enough to be honest about who we were and what we needed from each other. I don't want to run away, I said finally. I want to walk toward something. Toward you. But I don't know how to do that yet. I don't know how to be the person who gets to want what I want. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words against whatever fears he had been carrying since the night he showed up drunk on my doorstep and told me he had been looking for someone like me. Finally, his expression softened slightly, and he said, "Can we take walks again?" It was not a declaration of love or a promise of forever. It was not even a forgiveness of the years we had spent pretending we were other people. But it was a beginning, a way to move forward without pretending we knew where we were going or what we would find when we got there. I nodded, feeling something ease in my chest for the first time since I had moved into the guest room. "Yes," I said, "we can take walks." And so we did. We walked through the familiar streets of our hometown like tourists discovering a new place, talking about small things and large things and all the things we had never allowed ourselves to discuss when we were still pretending to be just old friends. We walked past the houses where we had grown up, past the school where we had been boys together, past the lake where we had finally acknowledged what had always been true between us. We did not hold hands. We did not make promises about the future. But we walked together, two men learning how to be honest with each other and with themselves, and it felt like the most revolutionary thing either of us had ever done. 6 months later, I stood in front of my 11th grade English class on a Thursday afternoon in late spring, reading aloud from a James Baldwin novel that I had taught many times before, but was hearing differently now. The passage was about the courage required to live honestly in a world that preferred comfortable lies. And as I spoke the words, I could feel them settling into my bones in ways they never had when I was a different version of myself. My left hand rested on the open book, and I was aware, as I had been every day for the past 3 months, of the absence of weight on my ring finger. The pale band of skin where my wedding ring had lived for 10 years was barely visible now, faded into the rest of my hand like evidence of a scar that had finally healed completely. The students listened with the kind of attention that teenagers reserve for moments when they sense their teacher is telling them something important, even if they cannot yet articulate what that something is. When I finished the passage and looked up, I saw in their faces the reflection of my own journey toward understanding, the recognition that some truths take time to reveal themselves, and that the waiting is part of what makes them worth knowing. After the bell rang and the classroom emptied, I gathered my papers with the same methodical care I had always brought to the end of each school day. But instead of heading home to grade assignments and prepare dinner for a family that was learning to function in new configurations, I walked out into the warm afternoon air and turned toward the edge of town where Damien's house sat among its 2 acres of land that were finally beginning to look tended rather than abandoned. The walk took me past familiar landmarks that had taken on new meanings over the months since everything changed. The lake where we had sat in silence and acknowledged what we had always known. The church where Hannah still took the children every Sunday while I found other ways to tend to my spirit. The elementary school where Sophie was finishing 2nd grade and no longer drew pictures of her father frowning, though she sometimes still asked when I was coming home in a way that made it clear she was adjusting to the reality that home had become more complicated than she had initially understood. Damien's house looked different now, cared for in ways that spoke of someone who had decided to stay rather than someone who was simply waiting to figure out what came next. The front porch had been repaired and painted, the garden beds had been cleared and replanted, and the windows that had been clouded with neglect now caught the afternoon light and threw it back in ways that made the whole place seem more alive. We did not live together. We had never discussed whether we would, had never tried to define what we were to each other in terms that other people might understand. But I kept a toothbrush in his bathroom cabinet, and sometimes I would wake up in his guest room on Sunday mornings to the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Sometimes he would appear at my apartment above the bookstore downtown with groceries and the assumption that we would cook dinner together. We had learned to be together without needing to call it anything more specific than what it was. When he opened the door that Thursday afternoon, he looked at me with the kind of easy familiarity that comes when two people have stopped pretending to be surprised by each other's presence. His hair was slightly mussed from whatever project he had been working on, and there was a smudge of something that might have been paint on his left cheek. He looked like someone who had been expecting me without knowing exactly when I would arrive. "Hungry?" he asked, the same question he had been asking for months now. The simple inquiry that had become our way of acknowledging that some forms of nourishment cannot be measured in terms of food alone. I nodded, following him into the kitchen that had become as familiar to me as the one I had shared with Hannah, but which felt entirely different because it belonged to a life I had chosen rather than one I had inherited. We moved around each other with the comfortable efficiency of people who had learned each other's rhythms, him pulling ingredients from the refrigerator while I set plates on the table that had belonged to his father and would probably belong to him for as long as he chose to stay in this town. We ate in the kind of silence we had always shared, the comfortable quiet of two people who had known each other long enough that conversation was optional rather than necessary. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the kitchen in the same golden light that had been present the evening when everything began to change between us. But now that light felt peaceful rather than dangerous, warm rather than threatening. After dinner, as I was clearing the plates, I noticed something on the counter that made me pause. 2 Oreos sat beside a piece of paper that had been folded once, the same kind of note passing that had marked important moments in our friendship since we were teenagers. I unfolded it carefully, recognizing Damien's handwriting even before I read the words. "I'm glad you caught me staring." I looked up to find him watching me from across the kitchen, and for a moment we simply looked at each other the way we had that first evening when I had been wiping down a counter that was already clean and he had been standing in my doorway with a beer in his hand and something unspoken in his eyes. But this time, neither of us looked away. This time, there was no wife upstairs putting children to bed, no carefully constructed life that required protection from inconvenient truths. This time, there was only the warm light of evening and the quiet satisfaction of two people who had finally stopped pretending to be anyone other than who they actually were. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, next to my car keys and the reading glasses I had started needing and all the other small items that made up the practical details of a life lived honestly. Then I walked across the kitchen to where Damien was standing, and for the first time since we were boys together, I allowed myself to look at him without apology or explanation or fear. The silence stretched between us, but it was not the silence of things left unsaid. It was the silence of things finally understood, of questions that no longer needed answers, of two people who had learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words. Outside, the world continued its familiar rhythms. Somewhere in town, Hannah was helping our children with their homework and probably not thinking about me at all. Somewhere else, other people were falling in love or falling apart, or simply going through the motions of lives they had built from compromise and hope and the belief that tomorrow might be different from today. But in Damien's kitchen, as the last light of day faded into evening, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because it was easy, and not because it solved all the questions I had been carrying for most of my adult life, but because it was real and honest, and mine in ways that nothing else had ever been. And that, I had finally learned, was enough.